into life, whatever's on your minds, methods of meditation, general questions, specific questions. Sometimes it helps to spend a little time just thinking or reflecting on your practice, whether it's the most recent session or your practice in general, thinking about where there are challenges or where you feel like there's kind of what I call the edge of practice. Sort of goes up to here, and then you feel like there's some more potential, but where is that? How to take advantage of circumstances so that you can go deeper. How to take care of obstacles so you can go deeper. Whatever deeper happens to mean, I don't know.
So in some practices, Vajrayana practices, we're asked to practice the result or relate to the stage of awakening or relate to awakened being in order to pursue or push forward our own awakening. It's at least my understanding. But how do we relate to enlightenment from a place so far away from that state of being? Is that, practicing the result, when at the same time we often talk about we really don't have any idea of what awakening or enlightenment actually is. Yeah. So that to me it seems a difficult contradiction to step into.
Well, you're speaking of a practice, you're speaking of a whole genre of practice that's actually not sort of what we're up to on Sundays. True. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. So for people who just do calm abiding practice, the answer will likely not make that much, not be that directly applicable. But it's actually not a contradiction, because the short answer is in the fruition stage practices, the fruition vehicle practices, there's actually a prescription for how to step into that view. So that's the answer. Yeah. It's kind of, they say, is like this, jump in. So. From the point of view of the causal vehicle, the approach to practice where we gradually accumulate causes of things that will help us unravel our confusion. From that side, then what we do in order to relate more deeply is we read about the qualities of bodhisattvas. We read about the qualities of the Buddhas. So we gain some kind of appreciation. It's not sort of the direct, put your finger on it, now you know what enlightenment is, just go for it. That's not quite it. But from the causal vehicle, from the point of view of accumulating the causes that will gradually support the diminution of confusion, the increasing clarity, increasing loving kindness and compassion, then we read about it and you say, oh, then it's a matter of a deepening appreciation and more clarity about direction. So within my forest of confusion, which direction shall I point?
Yeah. So it kind of starts with an appreciation of kind of the relative attributes that we can relate to, such as compassion. In a bodhisattva would be an example maybe of how they manifest that. In a relative sense, we can relate to that. We know what that looks like a little bit more. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So in the transition from Tibet to Western way of thinking, and I've heard numerous teachers talk about how things will be changing because in order to incorporate it into our culture, I'm just wondering if you can maybe reflect on some changes that you see that might be beneficial or have already happened, or what's the transition going to look like?
Wow. The Dharma taking root in the West, in particular this particular tradition. And I'm not big on coming up with prescriptions before the fact. One of the things that Bokar Rinpoche, a remarkable meditation master that we had a really wonderful chance to be kind of connected with for 10 years or so. Early on, when we were establishing the retreat center, and it was a little bit kind of the Wild West out there, with people kind of camped out here and there, and construction going on, and we didn't really have an organized way of doing things yet. When you're in India, I was talking to him about this, not asking what should we do or how should we do it, because he'd already, even at that point, by that time, he'd made it really clear that he wasn't going to lead us by the hand. He really was going to depend upon us to figure stuff out. And I was just telling him about my contemplations about how we might establish some kind of discipline in that kind of Wild West outpost of things. And his answer really surprised me. It shocked me. Actually, he said, "You're going to have to do it the way the Buddha did it." And for those who don't know how the Vinaya, or the code of conduct for the monks, was created, there's some 256, depending on who's counting and which tradition, 256 specific vows for monks, and there are even more for nuns. And some of them are really arcane. But the story for how they came together was the Buddha at the beginning established a monastic community, and he said, "Okay, now we practice." And they came up and said, well, don't we have some rules? So the thing, thou shalt and thou shalt not, don't we have a list? We can't be a monastic community unless we have the rules. He said, well, I taught you the Four Noble Truths. You should be able to kind of engineer it from that, it's like about the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering. And even that much you should be able to get a clue. Then I taught you something about the path and that liberation's possible. They said, oh. And then if you look at the Vinaya itself, the list of vows, and you reverse engineer what must have happened in order for something to get on the list, it's an interesting window into the very odd and sometimes very naughty things that monks did. I'm not even going to go into some of them. It's like you have to read it yourself. But there are some that are very, very general, but also quite particular about your retreat. Your hut should be no bigger than exactly this much. It was like, oh, I guess some people were kind of modest, and then other people kept on adding on. They had the addition, the patio, the catio, and the pool out and back. So it's okay. Let's just settle it. The cabin be exactly this size. So in the same way, I think our practice and our interactions as a community will inform us. That's really kind of where the rubber meets the road. So that's the process. That's the process. Do you have any observations about things that have already transformed? I mean, one of the things I'll say that has transformed is that we've actually changed from, there's certain kinds of views that when we first met Lama Tinley, who was the first resident Lama here, he was from very rural Bhutan. After things were developed a little bit, it was only a week's walk to the nearest road. But he talked about like the relationship with the teacher, and one story in particular that I remember is a kind of sense of very definite hierarchy, and a kind of deference to the teacher. And he told one day, he said, well, it's like this. If you're walking on a trail in the mountains and you look across and you're seeing the field on the other side of the valley, and you notice all these boulders. You think that's kind of interesting. And then your teacher says, oh, look at all the yaks over on the hillside. You should rub your eyes and say, my mistake, there must be yaks. But Bokar Rinpoche he was quite different. He's quite different. Another thing that is kind of on the lines of things that Bokar Rinpoche said, it may have even been in the same conversation about Vinaya and what we needed. He said, I trust you completely, but you will make mistakes. Then the next line is more surprising. And don't think for a minute that Khenpo and I don't make mistakes. It's like, ooh, okay. I guess we're all really responsible for our own actions here. Kind of a very, very deep sense of pointing out responsibility. But that much is kind of a big shift in view. And he'd also say things like, You may read in some texts, particularly about a very high practitioners at a very high level in relationship to their teachers. You may read that it says that you should regard your guru as the Buddha. And he said in one teaching, he said, I want to ask you, how do you actually see your teacher? Do you see your teacher as a Buddha? Do you see your teacher as a bodhisattva? Do you see your teacher as a learned spiritual friend with good qualities? Do you see your teacher just as a colleague on the path? Do you see your teacher as an ordinary person? Start however it is you really see your teacher. Don't go by, you should. So those are things that just in the dialogue with, and watching what was going on in centers around the world, and hearing from Kala Rinpoche before Kala Rinpoche passed away, what kinds of things were coming up, and really meeting people and getting a sense of confidence that people really were making an effort in the practice. It's based on that. So those kinds of things. Those are so that's, do you have any additions?
Well, big subject. I think also of the Dalai Lama has said repeatedly, I think, something along the lines that, well, we learn a number of things about the material world from science, and if there are things in our teachings that, contradict that, or that, that are kind of disproven, we should, reject them. So the idea that, I think that that's another thing that's happening, and which doesn't, but then of course there's things where we have to be careful with sometimes teachings about things that we can't, let's say, physically prove, or some of those things may have a reason for being taught that's not like trying to tell us how the physical world works, but talking more about mental phenomena or spiritual phenomena. So, but in any case, I think that, incorporating the findings of science into our thinking without sort of deifying science, not like going on a wrong track with it, but anyway, I think that's a trend. And then I think it's pretty, well, people talk, sometimes the Tibetan teachers will be asked, or they'll just remark on sort of the differences culturally that in the East, they're very strong on devotion. That's just a very effective door. It's a meaningful path for so many people there who, if they have devotion to a teacher, then that just propels them to do whatever that teacher suggests, or to try to work with that. Whereas for us, we're much more, this culture is more educated and less devotional. And so there's, different strengths and weaknesses. And I think that, being here, that the Dharma will kind of make use of our strengths. So we can use we can all read a book or parts of a book or something in conjunction with teaching and kind of get that into our minds, whereas in Asia they would, they would hear the same teaching, and still it's not a bad idea here, but their technique would be you hear the same teaching 100 times and you memorize it. And that has some virtue, but they spend a lot of time memorizing things. And I think we could do with maybe doing a little more than we do. Because too, we'll read a book and say, oh yeah, I know that now. Yeah, I know the Four Noble Truths. Oh yeah, I know that, I got the 6 perfections down. It's like, well, the point is not to kind of have been exposed to it once, but to actually do it. But that aside, the difference, there's quite a difference there of our ability to, kind of read and study and understand ideas and talk about them, and is quite different. And even another difference people notice, teachers notice, is in the East, partly, it's just the cultural thing that they don't ask questions. And they partly don't do it, it looks disrespectful. And then here, it's kind of like we encourage it, and that's how we learn, and that's what we want people to do, so those are kind of, it's in a way, it's not like the Dharma there's anything different about the Dharma, but it's just our approaches, and that we have to incorporate those differences. But there's also, it's interesting, just the huge difference between, just again, a cultural thing of the lay people in the East who their main practice might be, supporting a monastery, giving donations, making offerings, holding special ceremonies. They're very big on, if something happens in their family or something, they'll sponsor the monastery to do long days of prayers or something, maybe for someone who died in their family. And here, we're very, attracted to the path of meditation and that tool. And fewer people in the East will actually do meditation. We think that's the core of the thing. And so in a way so again, it's a strength that we're attracted to that, and then we kind of probably lose out a little bit on not developing our side of offerings and that kind of expression of our faith and energy and connection. So those are some of the many things, and just in general, we're less into the, I think maybe it's related to the devotion thing, but we're less into ritual, less attracted to ritual here. And so, in general, we still use it in some of our practices, but we use the shorter versions. We use we kind of pare it down, and we do what we can. And I think it's important that we do what we can to make sure that what rituals that we use, that we relate to them in a meaningful way, because they really aren't anything much without the meaning. So, but it's really easy to just turn off to to just have a ritual go by and not affect us. And so it's a challenge in our practice, I think, but it's quite different. They'll do something all day that we'll do for an hour, as far as a ritual kind of practice.
Lama Eric just finished the annual Mahakala Puja sessions at Mirik, which goes on for 7 days, and it's 18 hours a day. and sometimes it's actually 24 hours. So there's a few little breaks here and there, but it's a different space to step into to do that. I think also about examples of the shadow puppet shows in Indonesia that would traditionally go on for like all night long for 3 nights to present the whole stories of the Mahabharata and other things. So there's some definite differences, and some of them are. Lama Eric told a story of working on a translation for Yatsen Rinpoche, and it was being done both in Chinese and in English simultaneously. And got to one part, and there was this phrase that did not. You could make sense. You could figure out what the words were. It wasn't like the words weren't in the dictionary. The words were in the dictionary, but no matter how he played with the grammar or the ideas and the words, he had came up with nothing. And he went to the Chinese translator and he said, "I'm working with this. I'm having a hard time. What's your perspective?" And the guy just said, "Oh, well, it's word, 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 word." He says, "Yeah, but what does it mean?" It's like that question had not even entered into that translator's head. Because that's not his job. Figuring out the meaning was not his job. The words were very clear, and that was his job. So a very different outlook. And some of this is a difference. There's a difference between, we say East and West, but there's there is some of that, but there's also a more profound difference between traditional and modern. That's actually, so sorting out which is which is an interesting piece. Certainly, having done the seminar in Taiwan a year or so back, 2 years ago now, that was interesting. Visiting their centers and sort of seeing how they did things and whatnot. Quite different flavor and style and emphasis. Just a short little answer.
Just a tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, that's the tip of it. But I think the real short answer is we'll do the practice and then we'll find out.
To wit. You brought up some interesting things about the differences, the different approach culturally from the modern, generally more educated, more urbane, more heady, and the more traditional. Do we, this is a question yet. I sense that when I come across a teaching that inspires me, and I go into it, and I read about it, and I read different sources on it, I start getting comfortable when I start feeling like I understand it, like I could pass the test, the written test, not the oral test. And certainly not the practice test, like show me how this works. So do we in the modern world, modern Dharma people, run a risk of missing the whole point because we understand it so well?
Yeah, it's not entirely a modern problem either. The story I told this morning in a different context was about the Buddha's cousin who was very, very close to him and had a absolutely perfect photographic memory, therefore recalled every single teaching that the Buddha had given, but did not put it into practice. And consequently, he had this, he'd talk about his cousin, the Buddha, say, "Yeah, big shot. Yeah, so what? He's got this aura that anybody can see at noon in full sun, but other than that, nothing. So, yeah. And we're not the only heady ones. If you want to if you want to not just bend, if you want to shatter your brain, try to read some of dig into the Madhyamaka logic, the traditional Madhyamaka logic. Any one of them, take your pick. I started out thinking, oh, I really want to study this. I really want. Then I read, I don't think I ever got more than a half chapter in, and oh no, it's not for me. Not for me. It really is a path for some people, and it can be transformative, but it is possible to be heady no matter where you are, what culture you're in. It's possible. But it is possible. I think one of the things, I was reflecting on this today a little bit, thinking about how many more sources of Dharma teachings there are at present in the West than there were in the 1970s. There was some point where I instinctively bought every book that came out, particularly on Tibetan Buddhism. And I don't remember when it was where that impulse sort of became entirely impractical, and not just financially, but the notion that I would actually read them all. We now have far more books than we could possibly read, but there's something in the accessibility, and also the accessibility of, say, all the web teachings that are available. There's a huge amount of stuff that's available, and a lot of it is very, very good. You can spend 24 hours a day getting incredible teachings and not have an opportunity to put them into practice. So I think that's one of our jobs. Bokar Rinpoche said pretty much every seminar, he said, my job is not to teach you all of the Dharma. My job is to teach you just enough so that you have a complete path of practice that could, if you implemented it, lead you all the way to enlightenment. So that was his concept behind the Mahamudra seminar program, the practice program that goes with it. So we have a variety of obstacles, many of which were invented long before our generation.
I do think that points to one that really is a special issue to the modern age here, and that is having this access to all these different teachings. You know, you could read a book, or you can hear somebody, and somebody says, "Oh, try, your meditation like this. 21 breaths or whatever." Then maybe you try it. Maybe you try it, or you think, "Oh, I'll try that later." And so you don't actually even try it, but maybe try it once or twice. But then maybe you read or hear, now you hear, observe the breath at the nostrils, or whatever. And so, I should be doing that, and then, but that's just an example. I mean, there are like 100 ways to use the breath in meditation. And that's okay, except but that's just an example where it's not even contradictory or anything, it's just a long list. But we can certainly get flummoxed by, well, which one is the right one, and which one should I be doing? And just having those kind of doubts and those kind of number of choices is like gosh, when they don't have our yogurt at the store and I have to choose a different one, it's like, oh my gosh, I have to go through, let's see now, is it organic and is it non-fat and is it, but where is it made and which, and the size and there's so many, so it can take, these choices can be, seems wonderful, and yet it's like, can be quite overwhelming, and another thing that keeps us from actually just doing the thing, and especially because the nature of the path is that it's not smooth sailing. So we sit and we do our meditation, we think we've got a good method, but halfway through it's like, well, maybe that isn't a good method because I'm not in great shamatha here, so then we blame it on the method instead of thinking, well, actually, we just need to stick to it and do it again. So anyway, so those problems, I think they had less of those in the past because they weren't overwhelmed with many, many, many different teachings coming at them.
Just to kind of add to that conversation, I think that I feel like one of our biggest problems, whether it's a modern problem or a Western problem, is that we want to know that it will work before we actually do it, and that we're impatient, and we want to know after doing it a few times, we should be seeing results already. We should already be there. We should already have some sort of sense of accomplishment, and we want to then disregard whatever method that we just tried because we want the preview, and we want to know that the product that we're getting is going to provide the results we're looking for. And I think that that's some sort of privilege of having so many things available to us, that we have our pick, we have the options laid out in front of us, and we feel like since anything is open to us, we should be able to choose the right one and then use that and get what we're looking for so quickly. We don't have any patience. I think that's a big problem.
Yeah. Patience is one of the things that's actually, you could say, that's one of the main reasons that what are called the preliminary practices, it's one of the main reasons that they're structured traditionally the way they were, with these very long recitations, very long process required to go through them, because you definitely have to abandon the idea that you're going to get there quickly. That's like, okay, you can, there are hilarious stories about people who didn't. For those, the thumbnail on the to say what the preliminary practices are, there are a set of practices that introduce perspective of the Vajrayana practice, the fruition practice that we're talking about at the very, very beginning. And part of it includes reciting the refuge prayer and bowing 111,000 times. That's one. There are four that are sort of similarly. Yeah. And there are people who had figured they could game the whole thing. Said, "Oh, it's simple. I'm fit." One guy went to Kala Rinpoche's monastery in Sonada. Said, "I'll just do 10,000 a day, and I'll get it done in 10 days." He did 10,000 in one day. Could not move. Was essentially more or less paralyzed for several, and then slunk out. So that's So, yeah, poor guy. But that was actually the entry point to practice back in the day, in the 70s. That was really, oh, you really want to practice? Okay, do your preliminary practices. Okay. To recite this thing in Tibetan. And there was something really kind of magical about getting to about 30,000 prostrations, 30,000 bows, and feeling like I've been doing this forever. And then the little mathematical mind says, nope, it's about 30%. Ooh, I'm going to be doing this for twice forever. So you're kind of left in the midst of this place where you actually can't demand that you're going to get it right now. You know you're really in the middle of it, and if you actually are going to stick with it, you actually have to engage it. You have to kind of give up and really engage in the moment.
I think there's a big difference between what we need and what we want.
Yes.
I have another question instead.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm entering my 30 years of practice in my life, and nothing seems to be changed. Or at least some. I've seen changes along the way. So how do you go about it in some ways? And I keep on doing my practice, and it always feels that I really am not going anywhere. Even if at the same time, I have no choices not to do it. Because I think that if I didn't do it, it would be worse. So it's kind of a weird thing that happens. Obviously, my life is kind of different from when I had times in which I practice a lot and other times I practice less. But there's always this thing that it seems like it's never enough. And it's never really good enough. In some ways I feel it's good, but at the same time I'm like lost sometimes. Okay, whatever.
There could be so many possibilities there. And one of them that's probably true is that you've moved the goal. That if you really looked carefully, looking back at where you were to start out with, that you had some idea of you wanted to get somewhere. But you have, it's like holding the cup like this and walking to the back of the room and hoping that I get closer to the cup. And I'm not getting closer to the cup, but I am going somewhere. So there is something about that. There's something about that. Beyond that, it's also quite possible to engage in ways that have kind of a light impact, in which case it can feel like we're not really getting very much. And there are ways to engage where we really push ourselves to engage with really confronting how we're actually spending our time in terms of physical activity, mental activity, verbal activity, and being really, how careful are we in what we're actually doing? And that's the uncomfortable one. Actually, I just wanted to hum a few bars of mantras and come out good on the other side. I just wanted to kind of sit quietly for 15 minutes a day and have it transform somehow. But no matter what the practice is, if we actually can't keep our eye kind of on kind of the edge of our practice and lean into that, it will actually feel like we're not moving very much. But I still think this is probably happening too. So it really depends. We need to probably really go back and think, really take seriously the four thoughts that turn them on. Really think about the fact that we're going to drop dead. And at 30 years, you're 30 years closer to whenever that is than when you started. And I'm also probably 40 years closer to that. So to take that really seriously, say, okay, between now and then, what am I really going to do with my time? What am I going to do with my speech? How will I act? How will I take seriously the mind training aphorism that says, heap all your practice on your worst point? How will I actually do that? How will I actually look at, in the very brief recitation to support the contemplation of karma, it says, and each day may I examine my mind stream continually.
And that's what I do.
Yeah.
That's what happens once you practice for a long time.
Yes, then you
That's
can
what
do
you
that.
do all the time.
Yeah.
And, the problem is just to tame the judgment.
Problem is sometimes to tame the judgment, because the judgment is not really very useful. But at the same time, noticing, I think it's very important. And that's what I try to do all the time.
Yeah.
Even if I'm discovering indifference, sort of an indifference towards life,
Mm-hmm.
and really feeling like that I would like to be dead, maybe. But not in a depressed way. I don't know how to explain
just
it.
like,
but it's like, okay, it's
yes,
done. I mean, it's
been
like,
there, done that.
correct. In some ways. I mean, I'm not saying
Yeah.
that this is the truth, but
Yeah, I think in this circumstance, you need to talk to whoever it is that you really feel close to as a mentor, and express and expect that some pressure will be applied. So that's kind of the simple truth of the matter, I think.
I had another thought related to both those questions and answers. Having to do with space and time, and enormous space and time, and enormous sense of this project. Sometimes it helps me to, when I feel like Louisa was just saying, like, bloody hell, where does this go? You know, I've like been doing this a long time. But then if I back off and I just imagine, or I read a passage or somewhere that makes the dot of now in this very, very tiny, and the circle, it's the center of a circle that's incomprehensible, so huge that I kind of relax. Like, oh, you just keep doing it. And I don't ask for results. I just keep doing it. This is not like this is, usually I'm complaining, but then I get this insight of like, oh yeah, this thing is huge. I can't even imagine how big it is. For some reason, my own blather here is reminding me of a definition of God as a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. It's like that kind of thing. And so then my practice feels like it's just what you do. It's just like this is what you do in the day. It's what you do. Which isn't to say it's uninspired. Sometimes it's inspired. Sometimes it's not inspired. But you do it, whether it's inspired or not, it's just what you do every day.
Did you want something back?
Sure.
What do you want back?
I don't know, add to that or say, Jeff, you're off your rocker. That's
No. Keep going. So, to set our course into this time beyond time, take whatever energy that we have generated here and we dedicate it to think, may this actually be the cause for something remarkable, not just for myself, but for all beings. This virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state. Thank you all.